Under a canopy of black-limbed trees and white silence, the Ardennes forest holds more than memories. In winter, the snow wraps itself around the stories that linger here. Footprints that lead nowhere, a torn knit glove turned to parchment by frost, a corroded dog tagged the color of old leaves. Tourists know the famous names: Bastogne, Nuts, Patton's Relief, but the forest remembers other names, the ones we seldom say. Men who did not make speeches in town squares. Nurses who never wore medals in parades. Engineers with frost-stiffened hands who blew bridges they would later rebuild. Wiremen whose footsteps vanished beneath powder, but whose lines carried the voice of entire divisions. Black artillerymen who held their fire until the barrel rings sang in the cold. A Belgian family who lit a stove for strangers, knowing what the knock on their door might cost. A lieutenant who told 18 men to dig in, because the ridge in front of them was the hinge of a day the world would remember as a battle, and they would remember as an afternoon that never ended. The Ardennes, December 1944. A quiet sector, they called it. The young and the tired were sent here to breathe, to wait out winter behind a maze of pine and farm track and the warm insistence of village kitchens. The lines were thin, the foxholes shallow. A soldier careful with coffee and cold took pride in a dryness that could keep sensation in his toes. He muttered to himself, "Keep socks dry, boots loose, move your toes." He warmed his hands over the breath inside his mittens. He wrapped communication wire around his shoulder like a bandolier and steered it through the lowest branches where ice wouldn't snap it, and he listened to the quiet. Dawn, December 16th. The quiet broke. Not like glass a sound at once delicate and decisive, but like a door kicked off its hinges by the weight behind it. German artillery erupted from a line of hills that had been called sleepy the night before, their muzzle flashes flickering across fog like a broken reel of film. Mortar fragments cut at ice crust. In forward bunkers, men who had stacked their rifles carefully to keep them dry kicked them apart and fumbled for bolts that were already freezing in oil too viscous for this kind of cold. The ground trembled, and something old in the forest woke up. The imagination of fear. The German plan had a name that sounded romantic, whacked am Rhine, the watch on the Rhine, but what poured through the tree lines was math. Divisions, tons of shells, the logic of fog that grounded Allied aircraft. In the first hours, neither side could see the other clearly. The Ardennes swallowed color. American olive drab bent against a backdrop of white. German field gray vanished between black trunks. For a precious window, the air belonged to birds and the echo of guns alone. In those hours, you will not always find the people you expect at the sharpest edges. You will find a young Belgian woman, daughter of the Congo, and of a small block of streets in Bastogne, walking out of a cellar where morphine is counted like seed grain. You will find a Pennsylvania National Guardsman with a red keystone on his shoulder, taking a last drag before the fog shifts and his world moves. You will find 18 men of a reconnaissance platoon from the 99th Division, their insignia a white checkerboard on a black field, looking down a snow-lit slope toward the village of Lanzerath, trying to count the shadows moving in the white. You will find black artillerymen in a 155mm battalion, whose missions rarely make it into the movie reels. Men who know the exact seconds it takes a steel shell to arc out and burn a circle in the ice where it lands. You will find engineers unslinging their bundles of TNT and a man in charge, civilian engineer turned lieutenant colonel, peering down river through steam, rising from his own breath at a bridge that has stood since before these armies were even imagined, considering how to take it down so precisely that it crushes no town, but blocks a panzer column by minutes that will mean lives. When history lifts a scene like this from the snow, it chooses. It loves what fits on a poster-curved paths of tracer fire, onrushing relief columns, a Christmas card town ringed by tanks. But most of war is in the cold behind that color. It is in the way the frozen seam of a boot opens and turns pain into a clock that cannot be ignored. It is in the numb taste of old bread and wire-sheathed chocolate. It is in a civilian door opening on a knock and the quick conversation of eyes before the mouth speaks. We start in the white because that is how they started. A white so complete it erased familiar edges. A white thick enough to trick sound. A white that left every soldier to his training and his neighbor, far more than to the generals whose names would later be carved in stone. These are the forgotten heroes who froze in the Ardennes. Their breath fogs before us. Their footprints last until the next snowfall. The forest remembers. It is time we did. On the map, Lanzerath is a small pinch in a line of roads, a place you could pass without noticing. On the morning of December 16th, it became a valve. The 19 men defending a rice paddy-wide field outside the village were the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment, 99th Division boys, most of them. Their leader was a lieutenant who would never forget what he had told them the night before. Dig deep, cut stakes, interlace fields of fire. Frosted wire, blackened coffee, a schedule of the ordinary. And then the black-green blur of figures moving across white at the tree line. Against them, a battalion of German paratroopers, veterans of an army that had made a science of moving where push met gap. The Americans let them come. They counted, they waited. They fired only when the first wave reached the posts they had sighted the night, before with hands that went numb each time they adjusted a stake. The German line crumpled, reformed, came again. Grenades tumbled through snow and sat there hissing like snakes visible from above, until they detonated, turning white to gray. A machine gun jammed. Hands that could no longer feel fingers cleared it. Ammunition ran low. Men passed cartridges along the trench, like water in cups. Hours followed. When the smoke drifted, the Americans saw the effect of their patience. When the smoke thickened, they listened and fired blind. At a distance that fixed itself in their bodies and returned in dreams for decades, they heard German non-coms cursing to keep their men moving. A cluster broke through. One soldier stood to throw a grenade and was knocked off his feet by a bullet he would remember most for the way it took his breath away before it hurt. Dusk came early in the snow. By nightfall, almost every American on that ridge was wounded or out of ammunition. They were finally surrounded. The lieutenant, bleeding, told them to stop. They no longer had the means to move forward or back. They were captured. Their work unseen except by the men they held off would delay an armored spearhead meant to rip a hole in the American line, would make caravans of vehicles break hard for an hour and then another hour until a whole day had been rearranged. The platoon's citation would take decades to arrive. In the meantime, the winter pressed on. Elsenborn Ridge, a long back of land, quiet no longer. The 99th, green troops by reputation, held. So did elements of the 2nd Division beside them. No general's set-piece plan made this happen. It was the slow accretion of small choices to stay where carts had made grooves in the frozen ground. Men discovered that snow dampened sound and carried it both ways. A few cable layers pulled communication lines through drifts, while artillery forward observers, cheeks frost-burned, leaned on binoculars until the world cut itself into gray slices. The ridge became a breakwater. The German goal crossroads, fuel, speed found itself mired in a place where the frost ate rubber, and water thrown in the air froze before it fell. Elsewhere at the same time, down along the Amblave, a different Coulter measure of time was being set by engineers. They had no illusions about being forgettable. They were called when bridges had to be brought down in a way that would last long enough to matter, but not long enough to starve the very armies they served. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel David E. Pergrin, flipped open maps and studied photographs of towns whose names were written on the backs of family snapshots in Pennsylvania and Michigan. Trois-Ponts, Stavelot, La Glaise. They moved where the roads narrowed over stone and set charges that looked small against the weight of their own uncertainty. Above them, Camp Fra Piper was sliding forward, a column of tanks and half-tracks whose mission relied on speed and surprise and fuel, an element that every soldier had learned to treat like a living thing. Feed it or it dies. The Fetter, a German fuel can, sloshing in the cold, might as well have been a passport. The column's lead elements reached a crossing at Bastogne, where American traffic had nodded. Orders were shouted in two languages. Tires spun in slush that had turned to gray slush shot through with ice. Engines snarled. What happened next would pass beyond engineering. At Bastogne, American prisoners were collected in a field. A cluster of SS men fired into them. When the shooting stopped, the snow was stung with red. Survivors lay still, and then moved only when they could no longer stand it. A handful made their way to the trees. The news traveled through the cold faster than rumors usually do, because it fitted itself to the temperature. A warning to dig deeper, to shoot if you had to trust less quickly. The 291st moved along the Amblave, witnessing not only the terrain changes imposed by maps and artillery, but the moral landscape changing inside their own men. They blew bridges at Stavelot and Trois-Ponts, with charges angled so that stone fell into channels precisely designed to trap a column. They dug in at roadblocks with mines set like seeds planted in a hard ground. Roadblocks were odd little towns of their own. A crew would arrive, and the world would shrink to that few hundred yards of road, a bridge or the bend with a farmhouse for cover, a truck with canvas icing over into a shell. The men there belonged to whatever unit had sent them, but also to each other, momentarily unaffiliated, except by purpose. Sappers set satchel charges, their faces pressed close to a bundled set of wires that felt like wrapped snakes. Young privates with rifles watched the wolfish line of the tree inch closer at the edge of the road cut and imagined what it would be like to see a panther's hole slide into view, like a ship coming through fog to a dock that is only a rumor until it exists. They waited as though their breath might change the temperature. Then German motorcycles with sidecars, then half-tracks, then tanks. The civilians of the village watched from windows without standing too close to glass. Once or twice a round or three, the blast picked up snow and made it into glitter. It also turned metal to confetti. The biggest thing the engineers destroyed, and then again they built, was time. In villages caught in the middle, civilians moved in patterns that have no mark on a map. A woman pulled a carpet off a floor, not because she wished to decorate the cellar, but because the last family to hide beneath had said that lying on concrete sucked the heat out of you faster than simply being cold can explain. A farmer listened to distant engines and tried to judge if those low, steady notes belonged to Sherman tanks or something heavier. Children learned to stay away from windows if the day tasted like metal, a flavor you cannot describe until you know it. In these places, men and women were asked without words to choose, again and again, and again, what kind of risk they would take. A risk for a neighbor, a risk for a stranger, a risk for a soldier with mud at the hem of his overcoat, the kind of mud you do not see in summer, but that on a winter's day can tell you someone has walked from the forest to your door. The engineers choked on cold smoke and cleared it with curses that sounded like something else. Then they packed their gear and moved to the next bridge, the next bend, the next place where speed could be turned into duration. They did not stick in memory like the paratroopers at Bastogne would, but the shape of the battle bent around them all the same. There is a shape you can draw on a map between St. Vith and Schnee-Eifel, and you can watch a disaster unfolding within it as if it were an ink blot spreading through snow. The 106th Infantry Division, the Golden Lions, had arrived not long before the offensive, replacing a battle-worn division that had needed a rest. They were new to the line. Their sector ran along high ridges and narrow roads, with the sharp thorn of the Schnee-Eifel pointing east like a finger daring someone to break it. They woke into bombardment, an avalanche of shellfire that separated the brave from the lucky with a line as thin as a frost-fed crack in a pond. In the days that followed, two of the division's regiments, the 422nd and the 423rd, were encircled. The men of those regiments, hungry and already slower from the cold than you are allowed to be in war, fought on with ammunition measured in handfuls and then in single rounds. They tried to break out. Their compass was not a needle so much as an instinct to move toward sound that did not shoot at them. They were cut off again. Commanders weighed the sanity of continuing against the duty of not wasting lives. On December 19th, the regiment surrendered. It was not a scene from a recruiting poster. Thousands of Americans were marched east into a winter that would consume many of them before they saw home again. Those who had not learned about trench foot did then. Those who had thought themselves beyond embarrassment lived hours in which needing to urinate or cry became logistical events. But the 106th story does not stay on the blot. You can draw another shape at a place with a wooden sign, Barak de Frater Parker's Crossroads. There, a fragile stack of units formed around Major Arthur Parker of the 106th 589th Field Artillery. He had fragments under him, artillerymen, a few tanks, an engineer platoon, stray riflemen from a dozen commands. They faced the oncoming German wave at a place where roads met like lines on a palm. The air so cold that the cord on a field phone cracked if you bent it, so bright that sun-off snow could blind you for minutes if you glanced at it wrong. They held for days, a fist pressed against a large muscle. When they were finally overrun, when Major Parker lay mortally wounded, the defiance he and his mixed company had improvised had bought hours and then days for the men behind them. It was a crossroads in more than one sense. When you stand there now, you can hear trucks on the modern road, and you can imagine the sound of treads. The frost remains. It heaves small stones out of the verge, as if the ground itself is breathing. From the south and east, another story. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, a segregated unit of black American soldiers with 155mm howitzers, had set positions near Schonberg as the offensive began. The 333rd had long learned the art of being present without being seen. Their fire could call down thunder from miles away. Then they would move, because to stay in place after revealing yourself by sound is to invite annihilation. On December 16th and 17th, parts of the battalion were overrun, communications frayed. Roads that on the map looked like options became streams of dead ends and an enemy's choke points. In the chaos, a group of 11 men from a support battery became separated from the main body. As the German advance pushed through, the men were on foot. They followed a ridge, and then a stream, and then a line of bare hedges, until they came to the village of Wereth. There, a farmer named Matthias Langer and his family did what people had been doing in wars in that part of the world since men began knocking on doors with rifles on their backs. They opened to the Americans, brought them inside, warmed them. The time it took to pour coffee, to find a matching pair of gloves to whisper about where the Germans were in dialect that would not make sense to those who were not born to it. That was all the time it took for a betrayal to find its way to the wrong ears. Members of the 1st S Panzer Division arrived. The Americans were taken away into the cold. They were found later, their bodies with marks that told a story not simply of shooting, but of being made to suffer before the shooting. The 11 men lie now in a story that was almost lost to memory. For decades, only the Langer family spoke of that day outside their village, because the village had learning to do, and the world felt busy with other griefs. Eventually, a memorial was raised on a lane at the edge of Wereth. It stands quietly in the cold. Not all of the 333rd was lost. Survivors joined the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, another black unit, to support the desperate defense of Bastogne. Their guns were just one beat in a drum line of artillery that made that town as ring of foxholes possible. Coordination happened through wires carried by signalmen who had to pull line through snow that, when it had stayed undisturbed long enough, squeaked underfoot like sand in a desert. Observers spoke coordinates into phones that treated the cold like an excuse to be stubborn. Fire came down, and battalions like the 333rd and 969th did the job that infantry hears without always knowing where it begins. The shells they threw came back down to earth with a promise to make a difference. Its sound makes sound like certainty. In truth, they made something more fragile and more essential in those hours. The possibility of holding on. Holding on was what St. Vith was about, to the town that refused to be a town you could pass through. For 6 precious days, elements of the 7th Armored Division and infantry units, under the steady hand of Major General Alan Jones and Brigadier General Bruce Clark, fought for the town and the road net it commanded. Foxholes were scratched into gardens. A tank reversed through a hedge and felt the house behind its shutter. The Germans needed St. Vith because it turned their improvised roads into a corridor worth the name. The defenders took turns being hungry and being awake. In the end, St. Vith fell, but not in time to keep the German timetable from fraying again. These days mattered in ways that you only see when you understand that in war, time is everything. Time for an army to shift time for resupply to arrive, time for a general's idea to turn into a colonel's orders to become a sergeant's sentence to a private. Movement in a ditch in the dark, at a temperature where breath looks like smoke until you disappear into it. All the while, the weather continued its own campaign. Boots froze. Socks dried on lines that doubled as field telephone loops. Layer upon layer, men tried to outthink a cold that did not care about morale. They rubbed their feet to avoid what the army vernacular termed neatly into trench foot, a clinical phrase that covered pain, numbness, sores. In some outfits in those weeks, more men would be evacuated for cold injuries than for bullet wounds. There's a photograph taken by a medic of a pair of feet that look like candle wax. The man in the picture would have walked on those feet until someone told him to stop. War does not always allow anyone to stop. The forgotten heroes did not all wear olive drab. Some were the very people who waved when Allied convoys first came through in September, and who now were watching a different army, wearing a different color, come back into their streets. They learned to read the shoulder patches quickly, to detect the difference between an American vowel and a German one. They learned to hide again. The price of hiding was the first time you heard someone you loved snore shallowly, because there was not enough air for deep breaths under that many blankets. The price of not hiding was something else entirely. A door, a boot, a shout. The Langer family of Wereth had known both prices. Other families knew them too, and made their choices anyway. The road to Bastogne was clogged not just with vehicles, but with names. Pharmacies became aid stations. Church basements became triage. The sign at the edge of town might as well have said, "This is where roads end for now." The 101st Airborne's arrival transformed a place that could have been a pause into a stand. The 10th Armored Division Team Cherry, Team Desibrai, Team O'Hara threw themselves into satellite villages, holding Novel, Longvilly, and the approach routes in front of a town that would become as much an idea as a map point. The famous lines we remember were spoken there, and the famous lines we forget were spoken there too. Hold it. We need more bandages. Put him here. Keep your head down and your feet moving. On one side of town, under a sky that threw water and froze it in the next breath, medics worked in a Catholic aid station, then another, when the first was broken open by shells. An evacuation hospital had long since been pushed back by the German rush down the roads, so surgeons became improvisers and nurses became magicians. Among them, a woman named Augusta Chiwy, born in the Congo, trained in Louvain, visiting family in Bastogne for Christmas, found that the front moved, and sometimes war does not ask what you intended to do with your day. She volunteered. You can picture her in a coat too thin for this weather, in a town that had never expected to be a crossroads in a season like this. Her hands did not belong to any army, but they carried men from trucks, from sleds, from literal doors used as stretchers, because there were not enough stretchers. The town's other angel of mercy was Renée Lemaire, a Belgian nurse who had the bad luck to be kind and the good luck to live near a place where kindness could be used. She tended to the wounded in a large garage that had been turned into an aid station on Rue de Neufchâteau. On Christmas Eve, the station took a direct hit. Flames rose. Men rushed to pull out whoever could be saved. Renée died in the fire. Later, they would name a square after her. But for days, there were no squares, only the small, curved space of hands held so that morphine could be pushed into a vein. Outside, when the fog held to the trees, nothing flew. Pilots stood by their planes and stared at skies that refused to become clear, like a patient refusing to come out of anesthesia. On December 23rd, the weather broke. The sky turned a color that has to have a word in a language we do not speak. That particular winter blue that makes everything on the ground feel as if it has been seen like a child being picked out in a crowd. The planes came C-47s flying low, their bellies opening like giant hands, crates with white parachutes drifting down into the lap of the town that waited like a child with both arms up. Tank shells, ammunition, plasma, blankets caught and hauled by men who had run out of ways to say thank you and resorted to shouting joy. P-47s rolled over to hit German columns, and the yards of tracks and wheels and crews caught in the open knew the sound by then and understood. It was a relief that arrived like a moral argument settling, and it did not warm anyone immediately, but it promised warmth. In the night, the temperature plunged again. The world worked cruel arithmetic with ice. A foxhole, if you did not know to line it with straw or brush, became a freezer chest that wicked heat out of you. Helmets collected condensation that froze in the rim and dropped spangles of ice into a man's hair when he shifted suddenly. The act of urinating became a consultation with fate. Now, later, here, there, in motion to drive warmth through your muscles, or still, because you had no right to think your pain mattered in the calculus of a firing line. Medics rubbed feet. Engineers hammered snow into blocks for hasty shelter walls. Forward artillery observers drank hot coffee too quickly and burned their tongues. The commonwealth of the front exists nowhere as purely. No one is of special value. Everyone is of infinite value, as it does in a winter attack when the fog removes all tears and all you have is neighbors. Across the lines, the cold did not differentiate. In the German ranks, Volksgrenadiers, many of them too old or too young for the elite designations, marched in uniforms not always built for this climate. Some wore scarves knitted by women who had sent them off with blessings that froze on the first morning. Teenagers and men, whose sons were old enough to serve, shivered under shells labeled in a language they did not speak, in a script their schoolroom teachers had insisted they would never need to read. They huddled too. A young German private wrote home on thin paper, the kind used to save weight. He said nothing brave. He asked for socks, for salve, for a photograph of his sister's baby. He had trouble holding the pencil. The letter took too long to arrive. At the edges of war, other uniforms appeared that did not belong. Operation Grief, a plan built on deception, sent German commandos in American uniforms into the Allied rear to switch signposts, to spread rumors, to cut wires, to sow doubt where the map ought to be the one stable thing. Americans set up roadblocks, yet another kind of crossroad town with its own rules, and quizzed drivers about baseball and presidents, about the number of states, about the names of swing band leaders. It was strangely comic and deadly. Suspicion scrapes men raw quickly. Friendliness slowed to a cautious nod. Eyes flicked to name tapes and then back to hands. The cold had opinions of its own about this. It wanted to strip fingers of their willingness to move quickly, and it did. Back on those roads where the engineers had bought and paid time, where infantry had knotted themselves into hedgerows, until the hedgerows remembered their names, other units must also be acknowledged. Glider pilots, men whose job usually ended when their aircraft obeyed gravity one last time, now fought as infantry. Truck drivers from the Red Ball Express days, many of them black soldiers, who had learned to hate the hunger of the roads almost as much as they learned to outdrive it. The Army now asked them to carry rifles. Volunteer 5th platoons of black infantrymen were formed to reinforce depleted rifle companies. It was integration born of necessity. It would plant seeds that would grow later in a war's quieter moments. For now, it meant that men used to wheel grease learned the map grids of the front and the weight of a rifle in winter gloves. and the caretakers of the dead graves registration units moved too. They worked in fields where they had to keep their breath from freezing their eyelashes together as they knelt with tags and pencils that had to be warm under arm before they would write. They catalogued, they gathered, they carried away gently what had been forced down brutally. They are the quietest of the forgotten, and they are needed everywhere in any list of who holds things together when things come apart. The siege of Bastogne broke in the way sieges do, with a contact that resembled touch more than it resembled anything cinematic. Patton's Third Army pushed north, and the road in felt like something found, not something conquered. There were handshakes, and then there was work. Trucks rolling material, men moving into and out of positions, with an energy that had less to do with victory than with relief at no longer being the most forward place on a map. The forest around the town remained tall and dignified, and entirely uninterested in what would be written about it later. By January, the bulge in the lines that an aerial photograph could find had begun to flatten. The German advance had been halted, then bent back. The weeks that followed were a scrubbing. The map was redrawn by feet and by shovels and by replacement units learning to live in spaces that still echoed with the last voices to occupy them. The snowpack deepened and then became crust and then became slush. Ammunition boxes found new purpose as seats, tables, and shields. A soldier, moving into a position vacated hurriedly by men who had moved there under duress weeks before, would sometimes find a photograph tacked inside a foxhole. Someone else's sweetheart, someone else's mother. He'd leave it or he'd fold it and put it in a pocket. There are rules about such things, and none of them are written down. In the aftermath, numbers ascended to do their cold work. Casualties and tonnage and sorties. But there were other counts that the cold had kept. The U.S. Army logged thousands of cases of trench foot and frostbite during those weeks. Medics would remember the weight of a limb that did not want to bend. Company clerks would remember the awkward way a pencil had to be held with gloves too thick to grasp. And memory, for decades, clung to the brilliant images, the easy ones, the airborne trooper with the stubbled grin, the general with the one-word reply. It did not, often enough, cling to the silent tasks. Because nobody makes films about wire teams who keep a line open for 8 hours and then relay it when artillery chews it to pieces. Nobody lines sidewalks for a parade for the men who did not shoot, but who cried alone because they had to leave a buddy whose body could not be retrieved until spring. We do not always stand in silence for the people who opened their doors to strangers and paid for it in the ruins of their barns or their sons' names. And so the Ardennes in winter became a place where memory had to be pressed into service as well. It adjusted itself, corrected itself, found that the lens could be widened. The intelligence and reconnaissance platoon at Lanzerath, their story restored decades later, was recognized with a Presidential Unit Citation in 1981. A small marker on a ridge that once looked out onto white recounts their hours, and the way their dig and hold had been so exact that it could change an army's day. The 106th, long shorthand for disaster because of the surrender under encirclement at the Schnee Eifel, began to have its own story of defiance told. The stand at Parker's Crossroads, the men who kept their dignity on winter roads that led not home, but to barbed wire. Their veterans told their children that they had not been allowed to be romantic, only necessary. The 291st Engineers mounted little plaques at rebuilt bridges. A man named Pergrin explained to his children what it means to take something down with grace, so you can someday put it back up and make it hold. He'd tell how, on one road, his men had lain in a ditch while a German battle group rattled by, and how the water seeped into his coat there, and did not admit for days that it was cold. Those kids would run a hand over a cold rail and feel it vibrate at the idea of a tank crossing. The men of his unit had built a famous bridge later, indeed, but first they had blown lesser ones at the right moments. The mathematics of time were equal to both acts in their effect on lives. In Wereth, a stone was placed where the path meets the field, and names were carved with care. The Langer family, who had kept their door open to the Americans, now kept their memories open to visitors who asked questions in voices low, for reasons the air still understands out there. You can go and stand there. You will feel the wind. You will see the field. Names like Frank, Magger, Turner, Stewart, moss names that belonged to men whose stories had worn smooth in the minds of those who grieved them, now sit down in a place that does not move. In Bastogne, a monument named Mardassin catches the eye. The big gestures will always be easier to point to, but go instead to the street where the aid station burned and feel the way a row of houses can carry the memory of a single night in their bricks. Think of Renée Lemaire, the sound of glass turning to powder. Think of Augusta Chiwy, who went on to live a quiet life away from headlines, her work largely forgotten until historians and grateful soldiers found her again, and she was thanked properly by the country she had saved strangers from. She stood there, an old woman. The winter on her face was kind, and the men who froze at Elsenborn Ridge while holding the line also went home, many of them, to jobs that required them to be both punctual and practical. Ask them, years later, about the smell of a December morning and watch them pause. Their eyes might drift somewhere to the left. It was cold, they would say, apologizing for the limits of language. We held. They would talk, if asked the right way, about boots, the first and last measure of comfort. Some units got shoe packs in time, rubber-bottomed boots that kept water out until they kept water in too, and then feet softened and froze. They would talk about never again wanting to see steam rising off wool as it dried over a stove. They would mention how someone taught them to sleep with their M1 rifles inside their coats so the bolts wouldn't freeze. The Belgian villagers who fed and hid and prayed, who held a baby in a cellar while shells ground their street numbers off the walls. When the war asked them to be brave, they were, and when the war was done, they went back to baking and milking and repairing roofs. Their bravery was seasonal, because that was the season the world required it. It does not diminish them. It makes their courage more honest. Look at the village registers in towns like Stavelot and Malmedy, and you will find gaps. Families who were there and then were not. The SS killed civilians in cold blood in those streets, and their neighbors remembered, and the stones remembered. Memory is not always a comfort. Sometimes it is a place you visit, because leaving flowers matters anyway. Stand at a crossroads in the Ardennes on a day when the sky is a lid of pewter. A semi goes by, and the air moves the way it must have when a tank passed. Close your eyes and hold your breath. Imagine the blow of air from a passing wing of a C-47 and the strange grace of a parachute opening in slow winter. Think of a wireman, his hand a little blue around the knuckles, running a strand up into a fir tree and tacking it there with a small nail. Think of his partner telling him a dumb joke about a ball game he had not seen because he had never been to New York, but he knew the names. Think of the sound of laughter in a foxhole, not bright, not long, enough to remind you that the lungs still work. History is always in danger of becoming a highlights reel. The long uncut footage of human endurance and common competence is often spliced out. The forgotten heroes of Lanzerath, of the Schneeifel, of the Wereth Lane, of Elsenborn's low ridge, of the bridge at Trois-Ponts, of the cellar in Bastogne, do not fit neatly on a poster. They do not need to. They fit neatly into the idea of what society owes itself. The notion that the work done in quiet deserves to be remembered with the same care we give to the loud. Read their names. Say them out loud. Visit the small markers as well as the big arches. Teach school children that the Battle of the Bulge was not simply a map bulging. It was people bending, but not breaking in a cold that had its own politics and did not care for ours. There is a temptation to make of winter a metaphor. Resist it for a moment, and instead remember how physical it was. The ache in the joints. The way a canteen froze solid if you forgot to empty it halfway, so that you carried a cylinder of ice, like a joke, with a punchline that made no one laugh. The way a scarf could save a life. And then, if the metaphor comes anyway, allow it that frost preserves, that some things are kept so that they can be found when warmth returns. The Ardennes kept these stories under ice for a long time. We have them now. We can warm them with breath and share them around a table. The subtle thing to do now is not to shake our heads or to clench our fists. It is to look carefully at the places where people stand between what is and what could be worse, and to attend to them while they are there, not only when the snow has melted and the cameras arrive. To remember that a winter night in a small town where a nurse decides to go back in through a door that has just been blown off its hinges is worth the same attention as a spare sentence from a general. To admit that heroism often wears layers, not medals. Somewhere in a museum drawer lies the knit glove of a man who pulled wire on a morning when the snow made everything feel new and old at once. There is mud still in the weave at the wrist, and you can see the pattern his fingers made inside it over and over as he flexed against the cold. Somehow, the glove found its way to a shelf with a tag. It has a number now. He did not. But when you go to the Ardennes, and you stand in a silent clearing where a white wooden cross once leaned at a slight angle, the forest will tell you something if you are very quiet. It will say, he was here. They were here. They froze and held and moved and were still. They bought time and bent maps and carried each other. They were the hinge of a day, of a week, of a war. And we can carry them now.